Shabbat Shalom, friends. The last time I spoke to you was the first time I pre-recorded myself, and here's my second time. But the last time I was in Brooklyn, New York, sitting in front of a large library of my cousin's husband's, who is a rabbi. This time I'm back in California, and I have my little bookcase here, and the sunshine that's really warm outside. It was a difficult decision to come home from New York because I had to go on several methods of transport, and it was right in the height of the pandemic on the 24th of March. I was terrified almost when I was going to the airport, and my cousin said to me, you know, you can change your mind. The minute you get there, if you decide to come back, you can come back. And that made me feel better. And yet still I was anxious. And it was funny because I thought, what should I do with this fear? What's the purpose of this fear? And then I realized I had written about it in my own book, The Healing Hand, 5 discussions to have with the dying who are living. Don't even remember the name of my own book. Anyway, I gave myself my own comfort just by reading my own words. When I got to the airport, it was almost empty, and the flight home was eerie because out of 139 seats in economy, I was only one of 16 passengers. I had to take 2 flights that had been changed 4 times before I left, and there was only 2 people in Las Vegas airport where I changed. When I got on the next plane, it was just me, 1 other passenger, and crew. When I got home to Orange County, I had to take another ride to get home. And so I decided that I was going to quarantine myself for 14 days, just to be sure that when I went out, I didn't give the infection, the virus, to someone else in case I had picked it up. I did it more for the protection of others. My neighbors who live on either side of me and who've lived with me in my neighborhood for 30 years texted me, noticed I was home, and the next day there was fruit on my doorstep. I'd been gone for almost a month, and there was no food in the house other than canned food. So I was very grateful for that. And the next 14 days, every time they went shopping, they texted me to ask if I needed anything. And so I felt less alone, knowing that there were other people caring for me. Just yesterday, I had to drive to Los Angeles to officiate a funeral. It was different than any other of the over 400 funerals I've officiated, in that there were special protocols and procedures. And what I did was I downloaded Zoom to my phone so that the family in Chicago who couldn't attend could still be there virtually, could still be connected. But something else happened on that drive. It was very quick because there were hardly any people on the freeway. And I noticed that even though it's only been a couple months since I went to LA, I could see mountains and things that I had never noticed before. And the air seemed to be cleaner because there weren't as much cars on the road. It was very different, and I thought, it's almost like the earth is breathing. When I officiated the funeral, I had to stay apart from the family, and I couldn't touch them, and that felt weird, not being able to touch someone who's in mourning. So instead, I comforted them with my words and my hand gestures. I think I can't talk unless I move my hands. And with my song. I heard from the people on Zoom that even though they couldn't hear some of the words, when I held my phone up to the windshield driving behind the hearse, and they could see the casket coming out and being lowered into the ground, They felt like they were there. They felt the solemnity of the occasion, and they were grateful that we were still able to connect. On my way home, the traffic slowed down a little bit right past the Citadel, the old Goodyear factory on the 5 freeway. And it's lit up now. It's a shopping center, and they had ads. But instead of the ads, it said, "This too shall pass," reaching out to the people who were driving on the freeway and passing by. At the end of the funeral, I mentioned to the family, both watching on Zoom and standing before me, that there's still a way to connect. We can connect through technology, and we're very lucky to have that. This week we read Parshat Tazria and Parshat Metzorah together. The Torah is divided into 54 weekly readings because a lunar year has 54 weeks in it. And we combine on years when we don't have a leap year, because on a leap year we add an extra month. So this is the second time that we will be combining the portions. Actually, the first. And Tazria and Metzorah talk about impurity, and it starts out with a woman giving birth and the issue of blood, and it talks about bodily impurities of birth and nocturnal emissions and all kinds of diseases. And then in chapter 13, Tazria talks about Metzorah, the leper, somebody who has leprosy. Now, the leprosy that is in the Torah is not the same kind of virus that we know of today, the leprosy, the skin disease. What this was it mentions if you see a white spot, the priest examines it, and then a person is quarantined. In the Hebrew, it's lisgor, to close, to be shut up. They're quarantined, the Torah tells us, for 7 days. And then after that 7 days, the Kohen, the priest, comes and checks the skin. If it's faded or if it's the same, then the priest quarantines the sick person for another 7 days. If after that 7 days they're well, they can go back to the community, and if not, they stay under quarantine for as long as it takes to get better. Rashi and other commentators have said that the kind of leprosy that they're talking about is a physical manifestation of a spiritual impurity. Whether Dr. Fauci would agree with that today, I don't know. But it's interesting that that kind of leprosy didn't just grow on a person's body. You could see it. It would grow on the walls of the house. It would grow on their garments. And the Torah tells us that when the person was allowed out of quarantine, first they had to immerse themselves, wash themselves and their garments before they could go back. But what was really interesting is what the commentators say, not about the quarantine itself, but about what happens in that isolation. How are they going to eat? Like my lovely neighbors, the community would leave food on the doorstep for the person who was suffering from tzara'at. But what else was happening to that person that was isolated? They didn't have iPhones and technology and Zoom. They had to sit with themselves. They had to sit in solitude. It was time to examine, perhaps, what was going on spiritually and to figure out how they would like to be with the family that they had to leave behind and the community that they had to leave behind. I wonder if perhaps particularly as this is Earth Day. I'm recording this on April 22nd, which is Earth Day. There's a message here when I see the earth almost breathing, that perhaps it's time for us to breathe and look at where we are spiritually and take this time of isolation and solitude to think of our own spiritual growth. Perhaps it's our opportunity to figure out who do we want to be and what do we want to do and how do we want to be when this passes, because it will pass and we will get better. And the earth itself is showing us how it's healing while we are all taking a breath and time and solitude. But we also have the gift, just like the mourners at the funeral, of being able to stay connected to each other through technology, through sound of the voice. I check every day, I check on Facebook, I go on social media. That's a social thing to do. One of the sites that I was invited to by a friend in Australia, who I met through Facebook, who had been in the same program, positive psychology program with me, she invited me to something called View from My Window. And every day I go and see a view from somewhere around the world, from the window of someone in Brazil or New York or Australia or places I've never heard of. And they put just a couple of lines of what that view is from their window and why they're there. I've seen a nurse from Texas who was in New York and showing a picture of some walls in New York outside her hotel because she went to volunteer to help during this time of crisis. I've been to Norway. I've been in all sorts of different perspectives. I saw someone who said, you know, I've been looking at this view for the last 10 years and I never noticed how purple the flowers are right outside my window. Now is time perhaps to change our perspective visually and spiritually. That perhaps there's something good that can come from this, as devastating as it is. Tazria-Metzorah affirms that God is always with us in this time. Our very words of Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Lord is listening to us, just as we listen for God. I wish you Shabbat Shalom. May wherever you go from behind your window, whether it's watching TV, reaching out through FaceTime or Google Hangouts or Zoom, connect with others. It helps not to feel so alone. And I'll leave you with this one thought. If you're sick, I wish you well. Refuah Shlema, may you be healed. And if you're grieving the loss of someone, I wish you comfort through connection. And if you're well and stay connected. Shabbat Shalom.